All right, English teacher friends. So this is a very interesting synthesis essay unit that I developed with a number of teachers over the course of the summer. So there were many reasons in terms of why we structured it this way. One, we all noted that last year, so the 2021-2022 academic year, engagement seemed to be low universally for most teachers. And then two, the skill gap became very pronounced as we got hunkered into the academic year, coming for a lot of us a 2-year hiatus from teaching because of COVID lockdowns and shutdowns. So this unit is an easy entrance point into the art of synthesis, but it's also very high engaging. So we ran this with some very reluctant, struggling, emerging learners in our summer school programs this summer. So it's been trialed, tested, and it is true. So I'll run through this in the normal fashion. I'll keep to the status quo, and I'll tell you kind of the nuts and bolts that went into it. So let's take a look at the prompt, and it looks like this. Forget the meaning of life. The biggest unsolved question that has plagued mankind since at least 1968 is, how many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Pop? This burning question is at the root of one of the longest running and best loved animated commercials of all time, the Mr. Owl and the Tootsie Pop commercial. Carefully review the following 6 sources. Write an essay that synthesizes at least 3 of the sources that probes why this essential question has confuddled mankind for as long as it has. So let me get out of this screen real quick and I'll show you what our sources looked like. So source 1 is the actual original 1969 commercial on YouTube. The link is there. Food Theory had a very interesting segment where they probed this question. So we watched that together as a class. It's about 20 minutes. We developed a note-taking strategy for students so that they could get some textual support for this particular source. And we went all sorts of various angles with it. The actual physics of the question. So from a physicist standpoint, how many licks does it take to get to the center of a lollipop? And they actually did a very intensive scientific experiment to get to that. This gets into people's impulse control with regards to eating candy, and it has a lot of percentages that's useful. And this one is kind of a decoy, but sometimes with the College Board, we know that we get 1 or 2 sources that's like we scratch our heads and we're like, why is that in there? What are kids supposed to do with this? So this one is closely akin to that sort of thematic conundrum that comes up. So what your ice cream eating style says about you is very relevant to how the students eat a Tootsie Pop. This actually gets into fast and slow eating and birth order, which is very fascinating. So students tended to like that. And then this is really truly fascinating. We added this as a seventh source, the marshmallow test, the delayed gratification in children test by Walter Mischel. So there's an article here, but there's also on YouTube an actual live recording of this test being replicated, and it's very interesting to take a look at that with students. And we kept adding and adding, and you guys can add, subtract, edit however you want. What your eating habits reveal about your personality was an 8th source that we decided to add, and is some cool stuff in here in terms of what your eating habits say about yourself. So in terms of running this experiment, here's what all of us teachers did. We came into class with this prompt and bags of Tootsie Roll Pops, and we gave each one of our students a Tootsie Roll Pop and said, how many licks does it take to get to the center of the Tootsie Roll Pop? Personally, what's it take? So they, indulged their Tootsie Roll Pops and came up with an answer. And then together we read and viewed the sources. So here's what's going to happen with this. The teachers that I worked with, I told them that, it's best if we assume a Bob Ross position with regards to this essay. And what I mean by that is when you Bob Ross your instruction, you paint with your students. So we went in and said, guys, there's a couple of ways to do an introductory paragraph. You can declare or invert. Here's 4 examples of declarative. Here's 4 examples of inverted. You've seen it 8 times. On your mark, get set, go. That really demystifies the writing process for your students. So what you're going to see in a second here are some of the samples that us teachers wrote for our writing workshops for our students. So I'm always asking that question. What if we taught composition like Bob Ross teaches painting? There's a seismic difference between the assigning of writing and the direct explicit teaching of it. So hopefully we're going to do some direct explicit teaching of it. So we get to the question, how do I write the introductory paragraph? And as I already alluded to, you can declare or invert. If we unpack what that means, the declarative literally can be housed in this triangulated formula here. So you begin with the thesis. Right out of the gate, just answer the essential question. Boom, drop it like it's hot, be concise, be as declarative as possible. From there, you flesh it out with some context and background. It is an academic paper, so I would like to see some tier 2 level vocabulary. And what I mean by that is just your average run-of-the-mill SAT level word. And then those of you that are familiar with my work, you know that I'm a huge proponent of Strunk & White's text, Write It Right. And in it, they have something called rule number 18. And rule number 18 espouses the idea that there's 12 different ways to construct a single sentence. I have a ton of stuff in YouTube with regards to this, but you will see our students be able to manipulate and flex their syntactical maneuvers pretty well so that they're not doing short, simple declarative sentence followed by short, simple declarative sentence. So oftentimes our struggling and emerging writers tend to stack independent clauses atop independent clauses, and that's pretty much the only sentence construct they manipulate. So there are 12. And then the big kicker is all introductory paragraphs are going to be 4 sentences long, no more, no less. So all the magic that's delineated here is going to happen in the space of 4 sentences. There's a whole other way that you can do this. And it's just flipping it on its head. It's called the inverted thesis. So in this case, you end with the thesis. You end with your point. So students might begin with a hook, an analogy, context, background, sprinkle in the tier 2 level vocabulary, focus on those sentence constructs, and it's going to be exactly 4 sentences long. So here's the kicker. We decided, as we were Bob Rossing our instruction, that it's really best when students answer the essential question from a first-person narrative point of view, to actually reflect and answer the question from their own experience with that Tootsie Roll Pop. So look what happens when we open it up to the first person. So clearly, come time for an AP exam or an IB exam, something of that nature, if students are practicing this for an A-push class, you want to flesh out that first use of the first person. For the most part, there is some flexibility. There is some instances in which you can use the first person. But for this, we're encouraging students to do it. It's an easy entrance into synthesis when you take down that artificial compositional barrier. So here's an example. The conundrum has persisted for so many decades because most people are too impulsive to seek a definitive answer. Our environmental surroundings, as well as our basic DNA structure, hardwire most people for failure to arrive at the truth of this simple quandary. Scientifically and psychologically, our culture places a stark preference on the now versus the later. As such, the nature of the question has gone unresolved for nearly 50 years. So again, it doesn't matter where the essential question is answered. It goes first or last. All right. And then the rest is just context and background. You're setting up your line of reasoning. And it's kind of like playing a game of poker where you're showing your opponent your hand and saying, aha, in the essay, in the remaining body paragraphs, I'm going to discuss the following things. And you just front load it a tad bit. So this one is a traditional, straight up nuts and bolts introduction. Note that it doesn't get into the first person at all. What we found is when we had students, and even ourselves, us teachers, as we were writing these, when we stuck to traditional compositional rules in terms of narrative point of view, we found that if we kept it into second and third person, that it was very hard to answer the essential question, that you kind of have to go first person in order to make this work. So this is one that we wrote that went into first person. Due to the fact that I'm firstborn and grew up in a family that does not honor delayed gratification, the answer is 8 licks. So you can see here that they've declared the thesis right out of the gate. How many licks does it take to get to the center of a Tootsie Roll Pop? This student is saying 8 licks. As odd as it may seem, environment plays a huge role in factoring the variables of this conundrum. In addition, so does one's natural temperament and personality. Given this range of factors, I am personally too defective to arrive at a more advanced and scientific answer to the question. So you can see here, I think this one reads better than the one that we just looked at. It's very direct. It honors the essential question and has a nice, deliberate, in-your-face answer to it. So I always tell my students, don't tap dance around the essential question in a synthesis paper, an argument, or a persuasion paper. Get right at it. And it's just for this particular paper, opening up the first person lent students to write like this. Now let's go back to the original template. You can see the vocab is up. Good words in here, words like gratification, conundrum, temperament, defective. So it's in the kids' wheelhouse. They don't overdo it. Also look at the sentence constructs, all very varied, right? So there's no repetitive sentence constructs. There's no parallelism going on in here. Nothing, redundant or reiterative. It's very nice, very flowy. And I think out of the gate, this kid's coming out of the gate blazing. So in terms of sophistication, they got it out of the gate. This is a very sophisticated thesis, even though it uses first person. Here's another one. I have the patience and eating habits of a starving prehistoric reptile. So the answer is 3 licks. So again, it doesn't matter. So you can answer the essential question first sentence or last sentence. So some of the struggling and emerging writers opted to go declarative because it's just easier. They ensure that they've got the thesis, which is half the battle. Delayed gratification is a foreign concept for people like me. My eating tendencies are also rather primitive in terms of my psychological and emotional development. As such, I'm just one person in a long line of people who confound the conundrum. And again, it's very good. So there's a fair amount of tier 2. It sounds academic. The sentence constructs, while not as advanced as the first and second samples that we looked at, still relatively good. It has good voice rhythm flow. So a good nuts and bolts introduction out of the gate, exactly 4 sentences long. Here's another one. Due to the harried nature of most American lifestyles, most people are conditioned to hastily pace themselves through a meal. So we're going to anticipate that the essential question is going to be answered last sentence and that this is going to be inverted because that first sentence does not answer the essential question. Given that there's always a practice to attend or an unfinished job begging for attention, our culture does not afford us opportunities to savor food. As such, the answer to the essential question has confounded many a generation. And for me, personally, I remove the wrapper and immediately chomp. So you can see they've answered the question in the last sentence. So you start with the context and background, and then this student decided not to go with, a hook or an analogy. Readers aren't fish. We don't need to hook them. You don't need to be cute. You don't need to be poetic. Just keep it academic. Answer the questions, stick to the demands of the assignment. So this one is also pretty good. Vocab's up there, sentence constructs fairly decent, and good voice rhythm flow. Here's one more. The fact that the essential question has gone unresolved for nearly 6 decades points to one fact. Humans are not as evolved as they think they are. If one is to look at it from an evolutionary perspective, our descendants do not savor, they devour. The brain of all species is hardwired to eat when presented with food. As such, my efforts recorded 8 licks. So again, another inverted here. The student answered the essential question in the last sentence, exactly 4 sentences. And you're going to see in the samples that we continue to explore a whole bunch of facets coming into play here. So my students, and again, these are summer school students of teachers that I worked with this summer, they're able to manipulate their syntax. So they're able to use hyphens, dashes, colons, semicolons, commas properly. They go through my Nuance Academy. They go through my Word Study Academy. So all of this pizzazz and flair is manifest in their writing because we teach it. Right? We teach it very explicitly, and it's the expectation that students are going to flex their compositional prowess on paper, just like this. So the next question comes to this. How do I write the body paragraphs? And for those of you that are familiar with my work, you know that for the body paragraphs, we always build them syllogistically. If you're new to my templates, I'll go through them with a very cursory glance right now. If you want to do a deep dive, there's a whole bunch of stuff in the YouTube channel that gets into the syllogistic method and this particular body paragraph template with more depth. So for now, I'm just going to go kind of like a review. So the syllogistic method comes from the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle ran a school called the Lyceum, and the rich aristocratic boys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, word wrangling, wordsmithing, basically kind of like law school today. And for those of you that are familiar with this tradition, you may have read or studied a book called Plato's Republic, by which they throw out the essential question, what is justice? And throughout the entire Plato's Republic, you have these great philosophical think takers that step to the mic and they say, aha, I have it. I have the definition of what justice is. And they drop their definition. And then the other students and philosophers gather and they find all the bullet holes and the logical fallacies within that definition. Aristotle noted that his really good students thought with a certain logical progression, like a mathematical computative progression in their thought, in their argument. And one day he had a eureka moment and he said, I got it. I'm going to call it the syllogistic method. And all it is when you argue from premise to conclusion. So here's an example. In premise 1, if I say arsenic is deadly, and I follow it with premise 2, my dog ate arsenic, we can conclude my dog is going to die. Aristotle called that cogency, thinking cogently, arguing cogently. So bulletproof, lockstep, mathematical, irrefutable arguments. And that's ultimately what we want our students to do when they write across the expository modes, even in literary analysis, rhetorical analysis, argument, persuasion. Here we are doing synthesis, research, to be cogent, to have real clearly articulated, well-defended, well-supported lines of reasoning. So how do we twist this into a template for composition? Easy. So the first premise of our samples that we're going to take a look at in a second, the first premise is going to be an argument containing a why reason. So you noticed in the introductions, you don't state your whys. you just state your thesis. You answer the essential question. That's all you do in the introduction. Answer the essential question, a little bit of context and background. Front load your hand. So in the first premise, you get into the whys. Why are you answering the question in this manner? The second premise is textual support. It's the teeter-totter balance between paraphrasing and quoting. And the conclusion is the links and the echo of the thesis. So the conclusion of the body paragraph, you want to tie it all back to the prompt and echo that thesis. I tell my students all the time, the first premise is a promise, right? You got to keep your promise. You got to go shake hands with that brother when you get to the end. So really smart students ask me this. They say, Mr. Kuhn, we're using templates. Clearly in the introductory paragraph, you are suggesting it needs to be 4 sentences long, no more, no less. We're using templates for body paragraphs, so therefore you must have a magic number in mind. And I do. I think a good substantive, substantial, pithy body paragraph should be about 10 sentences long. Hard cap at 12. So in order to have enough support and analysis, those little itty bitty 5 sentence body paragraphs that students submit, they don't cut it. There's just not enough in there to really advance and defend an argument with any degree of substance. So I say 10 sentences. Usually if they go above 12 sentences, they're going to just blow V8 and go on bird walks, maybe get too plot summative, regurgitate sources, break the line of reasoning, have logical fallacies. So a hard cap at 12. So let's take a look at a couple. First rule. The College Board on FRQ1 for the AP language exam says your argument must be central like 3 times in the directions. In order to fulfill and honor that rule, I tell my students this. Your first premise is going to be 3 sentences long. So take 3 sentences to state your why reason. So look at how these first 3 sentences articulate a why to the thesis. The biggest common denominator is this: impulsivity. Even reaching back as far ago as the late 1960s, kids were impulsive and lived predominantly by the pleasure principle. As such, one's age plays a huge factor in considering the conundrum. So during writing workshops with my students, I always ask them to put their first premise in the language of a promise. So for the purposes of this video, let's put this in a promise. I promise you, dear reader, to talk about impulsivity and how age plays a factor in that. And we're going to talk about some theory behind this, the pleasure principle. So age, impulsivity, pleasure principle. In the second premise, where we start quoting and paraphrasing, those are the things that we need to focus on. Our quote should be germane to that promise. And if it's not, then we're not quoting with deliberation and we've broken our line of reasoning. So everything needs to be tied to that promise. Starting with the 4th sentence, you can begin to quote or paraphrase. This is not just evidence in the Tootsie Roll scenario. It's manifest in most people's eating habits, especially ice cream consumption. So you're going to see here how we use that one decoy source. According to Baskin-Robbins, an ice cream company that probed the psychology of this, they determined that there is a direct correlation between age, impulse, duration of consumption. Young children, ages 5 through 12, want things in the immediacy, which is evidenced in the fact that 89% of this demographic bites their ice cream instead of licks. On the converse, the age group ranging from 65 to 72 years of age saw that rate drop to 17%, source 2. All right, so we know that students need to synthesize a few sources here. So you have to draw from at least 3 according to the directions. And this source 2 is used nicely. You don't want to go on and on and on and on about it. But the student did a nice job drawing from it. And all the quotes and all the paraphrases definitely are linked to that idea of impulsivity. It's the first thing mentioned in the first premise, so it should be the first thing that's paraphrased and quoted. And everything seems to be connected, so our line of reasoning definitely is intact here. So we've gone on long enough about source 2. Let's move on. Cornell University ran a similar study, but with pizza. Okay, hold on. So sources need to be talking to each other. I always say that. Have your sources be in conversation, be in concert with each other. So what's Cornell University and pizza going to have to do with ice cream? That word similar is key. Students need to be using words like that in synthesis to have everything be in concert. So it goes on to the next slide. 500 participants were carefully studied, and of the 5 to 12 age range group, proved yet again to be impulsive. According to the study, kids devour a slice of pizza in 28.7 seconds on average. By age 25, that number increases to 74 seconds, and by age 65, our elders take approximately 4 minutes to eat the very same slice. All right, so that's very good. We got a brand new source there, and the student probably should have left the source at the end of at the end of that sentence there. So, but nonetheless, it's good. They do need to cite it, but it's fair enough. We got a sense of where it's coming from. Let's go back here. Do you see how we're talking about pleasure principle, impulsivity, and age? All the quotes, all the paraphrasing need to be about that. So this Cornell study is very good at keeping the promise of the first premise. They're going to throw in a third source here. Matthew Silver, a child psychologist, suggests that this is part and parcel of being a kid. Impulse control is a learned behavior that has social and cognitive roots. So very quick, just throw in the third source, right? Now we're synthesizing, we're weaving, we're tying everything together. In the conclusion here, we got to go echo that thesis and bring it back to the prompt. It just takes a couple of sentences. In effect, therefore, the Tootsie Roll conundrum is a matter of age and development. Given the limitations of children, it is no wonder that we do not know the answer to the question. And again, that took 12 sentences to achieve that. So that's very good, very clear line of reasoning. You notice that this is very conventional, very traditional, because I know that some of you are a purist and don't want your students talking in the first person or writing in the first person. So use this as your exemplar and your model. So those of you that want to open it up and go first person, then by all means do so. We're just practicing here. We're just learning. So practicing and toying around with some templates. So here's the deal. You get to the end of the first body paragraph. What do? You bust out another syllogism. Do it again. So change your why reason, change your quotes and your paraphrases, and link it back, echo it back to the thesis and the prompt. Shoot for 10 to 12 sentences. So here's another one. We're going to take 3 sentences to set up the central argument. There are 2 reasons why this is personally the case: birth order and the environmental makeup of one's family of origin. As the youngest of 7 children, my mere survival necessitates that I eat what's on the table as quickly as possible. Further, economic hardship also plays a factor. So again, this is easy to summarize into a promise. We're going to talk about economic hardship, birth order, and the kid's going to talk personally about himself, being the youngest of 7, and the environmental makeup that plays on eating habits. 4th sentence, get into the second premise. You can begin to quote or paraphrase immediately. Hypothetically speaking, if one were to facilitate the marshmallow test like that of Walter Mischel in my home, there would be no point to see if a child would delay an immediate reward in lieu of a better delayed reward. So that's really cool. So we're citing the Walter Mischel, and that test has nothing to do with this kid personally, but made the personal connection. So that's the interfacing that I'm trying to teach my students to do with synthesis. And by opening it up to the first person, they can practice that. So I'm not a purist. I'm not, a diehard, you can't use first person, right? It gets them nowhere. They got to practice this, right? And by opening up the first person gates, they can practice these connections of how to synthesize and weave everything together. So out of this quote, we got to keep everything aligned with the line of reasoning. My father raised all of us on a single income as a truck driver while my mom stayed home. We got what there was. If one of us decided not to eat in the hopes of getting something better, the reality is that we would be going to bed hungry. Henry, and again, hard cap here. Like, it's not all about you. So wrap it up. You aren't a source. So you got to bring something else in. Henry Jepson studied this phenomena in the eating habits of feral kittens and correlated it to economic hardships in urban kids. The research states that in environments where food scarcity as a reality and hunger is known, meals are a matter of survival, not pleasure. So, one thing I haven't talked about yet, and I'll bring it up at the end here, is that my students tend to embed their quotes nicely. And there's a little template that I use for that as well. I call it the 5-word rule. If a student places a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keeps the quote small, it should sound conversational. Use brackets when needed. So all of the quote transitions we've seen so far have been relatively silky smooth. So you quote, analyze it. This explains why, especially with my ice cream eating habits, that I'm a cyclone who seems to spin their whole body in order to get one monster mouthful of ice cream. Source 2. Right? So tie in that ice cream article. So this is all weaving, this is synthesizing, this is tying the sources together, this is having everything in concert. In the end, echo that thesis, bring it back to the prompt. In essence, I'm like a feral cat when presented with guilty pleasure food. There's no delay, I simply devour. This is simply due to the environment in which I was raised. And that's how you do, right? About 10, 12 sentences every single time you can bust out the syllogistic method. So it doesn't just work for synthesis. Go through my YouTube channel. There's plenty in there to demonstrate that this template of the declarative inverted syllogistic works for all of the expository modes. So to wrap things up here, a couple of announcemements. So I'm thrilled to say that the National Writing Project has hired me as a lead teacher to host my Teach It Right 5-week mastermind through them. And this is really cool because given they're so big and I'm just some small guy peddling my textbooks and my brain children, they're able to offer it for a greatly reduced price because they don't have the overhead that I have. So for $350, you can take the 5-week mastermind, but also get a 10-hour badge from them for your professional development hours. So check that out, nwp.org. We're getting my course in a regular cadence. So we're going to, well, obviously it runs 5 weeks. Probably take 2 weeks off, run it for 5 weeks, take 2 weeks off. So beginning in the fall of 2022, we are going to be offering that on a regular basis. Lots of folks are saying that a 5-week commitment is a lot. So we're going to be recording a self-paced course as well. So look forward to that. NWP will be hosting that. And then I'll be doing some free webinars with Perfection Learning at the start of the academic year 2022. And probably going to do like a monthly cadence with them on just a wide array of topics. And then in the fall, November of 2022, I'll be presenting at NCTE with my good friends Tim Freitas and Brandon Abden. So if you would like these slides, you can email me at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. If you would like more information about the National Writing Project and my 5-week mastermind, I do have a webpage, www.teachinghowtowrite.com. nwp.org is also a great place to go. There's plenty of course offerings there, and you'll see mine in the heap. So be well for now. Happy teaching, happy writing.